On March 24, 2025, 1.5 million people visited the 23andMe website in a single day, a 526% spike from the day before. But they were not there to buy a DNA kit. They were there to delete their data. 376,000 of those visits went directly to the help page for data deletion. 30,000 more went to the account closure page. The California Attorney General had just issued an urgent consumer alert. 28 state attorneys general would soon file a lawsuit, and the Pentagon, years earlier, had already warned that this company's data posed a national security risk. All of that happened because 23andMe filed for bankruptcy. A company once valued at $6 billion, backed by Google, celebrated by Silicon Valley, named by Time magazine as one of the greatest inventions of its early years. Gone, with a market cap that had fallen 98% from its peak. But the bankruptcy is not the real story. The real story is what happened next. Because the founder who drove it into the ground resigned on the day of the filing, formed a nonprofit called TTAM, which simply stands for 23andMe, and then bought the company back with her own personal fortune, all $305 million of it. A bankruptcy judge approved the sale of 15 million people's DNA to a nonprofit controlled by the same person who had just resigned in disgrace. And almost no one covered what that actually means. To understand how we got here, you need to go back to the beginning, not the bankruptcy, not the breach, the business model. Because the problem with 23andMe was always hiding in plain sight. You spit in a tube, you send it in, you get your results, and then you never need to buy another kit again. That is the entire product. A one-time transaction with no natural path to recurring revenue. The company raised approximately $1.4 billion over nearly 2 decades trying to solve that problem. Through subscriptions, through telehealth, through drug development partnerships. None of it worked at the scale required. To understand the collapse, you have to look at the founder. Because in 2006, Anne Wojcicki was not just starting a company, she was starting a movement. Wojcicki and her co-founders, Linda Avey, who conceived the idea, and Paul Kusenza, set out to democratize genetic information, to give ordinary people access to their own biology. Sergey Brin, Google co-founder and Wojcicki's partner at the time, provided early funding. By 2009, Wojcicki was running the company alone. And by 2015, she had launched a drug discovery division, betting that the genetic database 23andMe was quietly building would become one of the most valuable research assets in the history of medicine. Wojcicki's bet actually made a lot of sense, on paper at least. If you have the DNA of millions of people, alongside their health histories, self-reported lifestyle data, and research consent, you have a pharmaceutical goldmine. The problem was the timeline. Drug development takes a decade, sometimes 2. It costs hundreds of millions of dollars with no guarantee of a viable product at the end. 23andMe was a consumer company trying to fund a pharmaceutical pipeline on the back of $99 spit kits. That tension never got resolved. In 2018, GSK invested $300 million in a partnership to use 23andMe's data for drug development, extended in 2022 for an additional $50 million. The partnership produced over 50 new drug targets. 2 reached early-stage clinical trials, but none of it translated into the revenue the company needed to survive. In 2021, Wojcicki took the company public through a merger with Richard Branson's SPAC, briefly hitting a $6 billion valuation on the back of pandemic-era investor enthusiasm. That same year, she spent $400 million acquiring Lemonade Health in a bet to expand into digital healthcare. By the end of that year, the valuation had already dropped to $3 billion. The SPAC had bought time, $600 million worth of it, but it had not fixed the underlying model. By early 2024, the valuation sat at roughly $120 million, a 98% collapse in under 3 years. The company reported a $312 million net loss in fiscal year 2023. Revenue had dropped more than a fifth. Operating losses rose to $188 million. Sequoia Capital had seen the value of its stake fall from $145 million to under $20 million. 23andMe had raised $1.4 billion and spent roughly 80% of it chasing a pipeline that never materialized. At some point, the math simply stops working. By September 2024, all 7 independent board members resigned on the same day, citing irreconcilable strategic differences with Wojcicki. She handpicked 3 replacement directors, giving herself effective control of a board she had just rebuilt, at a company she had been trying to take private at 40 cents per share. That price valued it at less than 1% of its 2021 peak. The proposal was rejected. Her VC partner pulled out. 3 weeks later, 23andMe filed for bankruptcy. The financial collapse was bad enough. What came next, in October 2023, turned a corporate failure into something far more serious. Hackers accessed the personal data of 6.9 million customers over a 5-month period, May to September 2023, without the company detecting a single intrusion. 5 months. When it was finally disclosed, 23andMe's response was to blame customers for reusing passwords. But what was actually taken, that is where this gets serious. The hackers specifically targeted customers by ethnicity. A database titled Ashkenazi DNA Data of Celebrities appeared on dark web forums, nearly 1 million profiles. A separate file held data on more than 300,000 users of Chinese ancestry, offered for sale at between $1 and $10 per profile. One lawsuit alleged the Ashkenazi list was compiled expressly in retribution for the geopolitical conflict in the Middle East. Another noted that given the Chinese government's documented history of tracking its citizens abroad, the data poses unique danger for Chinese 23andMe customers who may become targets of foreign government surveillance and intimidation. A third data set followed, 4 million more general accounts, advertised as including data from the wealthiest people living in the US and Western Europe. Name, birth year, sex, location, photos, health information, genetic ancestry results. All of it on a hacking forum, all of it for sale. This was not a generic data breach. Ethnically targeted genetic profiles, the most immutable personal data a human can generate, ended up on a dark web marketplace. The data cannot be changed. It cannot be canceled like a credit card. It cannot be reset like a password. And the company's first public statement told users they should have changed their passwords. According to a formal letter sent by U.S. Senator Bill Cassidy to 23andMe, the concern was that genetic information in the hands of employers, foreign governments, and hostile actors could be used to discriminate against individuals. The senator specifically referenced health vulnerability data that 23andMe's own disclosures associated with certain ancestry groups, elevated risks for specific genetic conditions documented in the company's own materials. The letter stated plainly that such information, once exposed, creates risks that extend far beyond a standard data breach. Think about that for a second. Your most private data, your lineage, your health risks, your ethnic heritage, is legally no different than a used office chair in a warehouse. That is not hyperbole. That is U.S. bankruptcy law. 23andMe eventually settled for $30 million, agreed to 3 years of security monitoring, denied any wrongdoing, and 1 month after that settlement closed, filed for bankruptcy. Here's what makes the regulatory picture even harder to accept. The Pentagon had flagged this exact risk in 2019. A memo signed by the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence warned that consumer DNA kits were largely unregulated and could create unintended security consequences and increased risk to the joint force and mission. The concern? Foreign governments exploiting genetic databases for mass surveillance and covert tracking. NYU law professor Aaron Murphy framed it plainly. It's not hard to imagine a world where people are blithely sharing information online without realizing their third cousin is a Navy SEAL or an operative of the CIA. That memo was issued 6 years before the bankruptcy, 4 years before the breach. The warning was specific, signed by senior Pentagon officials, and completely ignored by the regulatory bodies that could have acted on it. HIPAA covers healthcare providers and insurers, not direct-to-consumer genetics companies. The Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act covers employers and health insurers. Neither applies here. University of Iowa law professor Anya Prince described the federal picture in 3 words. That's pretty much it. At least 11 states have enacted their own genetic privacy laws, but none of them anticipated what happens when the company holding your DNA files for Chapter 11. Under U.S. bankruptcy law, genetic profiles are classified as a corporate asset. Same legal category as office furniture, same legal category as accounts receivable. 23andMe's database of 15 million DNA profiles was legally inventory, and inventory can be sold. Judge Brian C. Walsh ruled just 5 days after the filing that 23andMe had the legal right to sell customers' medical and ancestry data to potential bidders. 5 days. That is how long it took for a federal court to confirm that your DNA was a line item in a bankruptcy estate. While the FTC has recently signaled a broader crackdown on health data brokers, the specific loophole of a nonprofit buyback executed during bankruptcy proceedings remains a legal gray area that has not been tested in court. There is no precedent, there is no clear regulatory framework, and there is no federal law that specifically addresses what happens to your genetic data when the company holding it collapses. So who bought it? That is where this story takes its strangest turn. Regeneron Pharmaceuticals won the initial auction at $256 million. Straightforward strategic logic: acquire the database, eliminate the unprofitable consumer business, deploy the research assets for drug development. Regeneron already had its own sequenced genetic database of nearly 3 million people. Adding 15 million more was a natural extension of what they were already doing. Then on June 4th, 2025, the bankruptcy court reopened the auction. A nonprofit called TTAM Research Institute submitted a competing bid of $305 million. TTAM won. TTAM had been incorporated just weeks after Wojcicki's resignation. The name, an acronym of 23andMe. The funding, all $305 million came from Wojcicki's personal wealth. No external investors, no institutional backing. The same founder who had presided over a 98% valuation collapse, whose entire board resigned in protest, whose multiple buyout bids had been rejected. She had quietly incorporated a nonprofit, named it after her own company, funded it entirely from her personal fortune, and walked back in through the bankruptcy court. If this sounds like a clever legal workaround to you, you are not alone. Critics have called it a masterclass in founder self-preservation. Think about what that sequence looks like from the outside. She runs the company into the ground. The board quits en masse, her buyout bids are rejected. She resigns on the day of the bankruptcy filing. And then, within weeks, she incorporates a new entity, raises $305 million of her own money, and buys back the exact assets she just lost control of, at a price that represents a fraction of what shareholders lost. One independent investor told Fortune he simply could not process it. "I can't understand why there aren't other bids," he said, asking to remain anonymous. 28 state attorneys general had already sued to block any sale without explicit customer consent. Some remained opposed to TTAM specifically. Others found the nonprofit structure marginally more palatable. TTAM committed to a consumer privacy advisory board within 90 days and binding pledges that the data could not be transferred in any future reorganization unless the acquiring entity was another domestic nonprofit under the same privacy policies. There is also a specific legal concern about the nonprofit classification itself. Most state consumer privacy laws do not apply to nonprofit entities. By structuring TTAM as a nonprofit, Wojcicki effectively moved 15 million people's genetic profiles outside the reach of the primary regulatory frameworks designed to protect that data. Privacy law partner Gary Keibel called it a legitimate concern. He added, "Maybe this spurs Congress to realize we need a federal comprehensive consumer privacy law, because we don't have one." The court approved the sale. It closed July 14th, 2025. Katrina Fitzgerald of the Electronic Privacy Information Center said it more directly. "This is just the first example of a company like this, with tremendous amounts of sensitive data being bought or sold. The first example, not the last. There are hundreds of direct-to-consumer health and wellness companies currently holding sensitive personal data, genetic profiles, microbiome data, mental health histories, continuous glucose readings, sleep data, fertility records. Most of them are not profitable. Some of them will fail. And when they do, the same question will come back. Is that data an asset in the bankruptcy estate? Under current US law, the answer is almost certainly yes. 15 million people trusted 23andMe with the most irreplaceable data a human being can generate. Not a password, not a credit card number, not an email address. DNA, information that cannot be changed, cannot be reissued, and cannot be revoked once it is in someone else's hands. That data is now held by a nonprofit controlled by the founder who drove the company bankrupt, funded entirely by her personal checkbook, operating under privacy commitments that have no federal legal enforcement mechanism behind them. TTAM has stated it plans to continue the same products and services 23andMe provided while expanding its research mission. What that looks like in practice, and who holds Wojcicki accountable if those commitments are not honored, remains an open question that no regulator has yet answered. A $6 billion company collapsed to $48 million in assessed value, rebuilt into a nonprofit by the same person who broke it. And the law governing what happens to your DNA inside that structure, for now, it largely does not exist. So here's the question for the comments. Was Anne Wojcicki's TTAM buyback a genuine attempt to protect the data of 15 million customers, or the most sophisticated act of founder self-dealing in Silicon Valley history? Tell me where you stand. See you in the next one.